Hello, welcome to Macroeconomics, McConnell, Brew, and Flynn. We're going to go over Chapter 4, Market Failures Caused by Externalities, Asymmetric Information. Chapter, we're going to define market failures and the consequences of market failure. The chapter begins by looking at the demand side of market failures, the supply side of market failures, and the inefficiencies that can be found. We're going to go on and describe consumer surplus and producer surplus, and then define and describe private goods, public goods, the free rider problem, and the quintessential public good. We're also going to find the optimum point for goods. The government should use a cost-benefit approach when finishing discussing government failure. And the last word, we're talking about carbon emissions and the different ways government can deal with air pollution. As always, this is not a substitute for you reading the textbook, doing the homework, and all those other good things. So don't shortchange yourself. Make sure you're actually looking into this. All right, then, let's get started. Market failures caused by externalities and asymmetric information. Talking about efficiencies, externalities, efficiencies that are lost, the social society's optimal amount of externality reduction. Again, there is an externality that just costs too much one way or the other. And asymmetric information, we'll get into that in a minute. Inefficiencies in the marketplace. What do we mean by that? Excuse me. When you are producing too much or you're not producing enough of something. We talked about the demand curve. Again, the willingness and able for someone to pay for something. Supply reflects the cost that the producer is willing and able to sell it for. When you put any surplus of the consumer and the producer together, you get a total surplus. And what do we mean by that? We're going to go over that right now. Moving on to slide 4. We're on page 75. What do we mean by consumer surplus? Well, we'll use a quick analogy for the sake of argument. Let's say you're about to pay for a cup of coffee. Now, you think this is the best coffee in the world because the coffee is from the Java Exchange, which is the site that we're posting on. And you're willing to pay $13 because you're here. It is an outstanding cup of coffee, and you get a donut with it or a muffin. Let's go with a muffin. How about a brownie? Maybe you like brownies. Nice combo. You think it should be worth $13. You're Bob. It's only $8. Well, if in your mind you're willing to pay $13, but it's only $8, you have a surplus of $5. Barb thinks it's only worth $12, but she still has a surplus, and you keep going down to Blessing, who thinks it's worth $8 and willing to pay $8. And we'll get around to why this is important in a minute. But for those who have a surplus in it, this is where we're going to get to that demand curve and how we're going to figure out where the price point is for a lot of things. Remember, our demand curve is slanting downward, left to right, demand down. If we figure out where the equilibrium point is, you see, of the 6 people here, 5 of them have surplus, which means that they're actually willing to move down and still consume the good. This is how you figure out where the price point is. From the producer's standpoint, you work at Java Exchange. You're going to make the coffee, and you have an incentive. The more units you sell, you get a bonus at the end of the year of $10,000. You're a district manager. Now, let's say these are different store locations. Each manager has a different objective, and the price point that they can sell it at is 8. We've already established our equilibrium point. However, the resources are different depending on the area of the country. Chandler can actually sell it for 3 because labor cost and other things make it very efficient. Chad, on the other hand, is in a high dense area. A lot of movement has come in there. It's exploding, and the cost of labor is a little higher. So equilibrium may be about at $8, but there's no additional surplus. The store is expecting to sell it for $8 and does sell it for $8. Well, when we graph that out, again, supply up, left to right, it's an inclining supply curve. And as we did in the last chapter, if we put them together, this is where we come up with the equilibrium, answering the question where the price points come from, supply and demand. So now you start to understand where we get prices in the marketplace. All that consumer surplus means that the producer's surplus will start there, actually can make more units and charge more and justify it and still continue to make those units. The consumers, more people are willing to purchase it. As the price goes down, more units will be sold. And because you still have the green and the powder bluish area right above one another, or one's above the other, you can continue to actually still produce those units at that cost. Helps if you're the consumer to understand why the price point is, and the producer or how many units you should make. Now, what happens if you're not taking advantage of this information? You have what is known as an inefficiency loss, or actually a dead weight loss. Now, in a nutshell, our triangle BDE, you still have areas for actually produce more goods because you still have a clientele that's willing to pay for it. Let's say, for the sake of argument, our equilibrium is $8. You're charging $9, but you still have surplus. You could drop the price and actually continue to sell a few more units, which from a business standpoint is helpful if you understand your marketplace. And this is why the price may go up or down, because they know they have surplus, what you are willing to pay for. Your demand will indicate where the equilibrium point is and whether or not there's enough surplus in the market to make the good. If there's not enough good, that means there's not enough demand, and the producer doesn't have enough surplus. On the other side, you overestimate how many units to make. Again, perhaps it's $8 is an equilibrium on our triangle BFG. And we'll keep it simple again. For the sake of argument, you charge $9. However, the demand at $9 happens to be not 8 units, it's only 7. So you're making coffee that's just going to be pouring down the drain. You don't have enough surplus buyers in this instance, in this case. You've overdone it. And then before, you had people at the demand, but not that many people who are willing to pay for it. So you took it up to 9 and found out, well, this number of people who are actually willing to pay for that isn't as high as I thought. So you have overdone it, which is not a good thing. Not a good thing, my friend. All right. Keeping in line, we've already covered those areas. Let's get to externalities. We are on slide 10 on page 81. Just a quick warning for people who are following in the book. The graphs and the verbiage explaining the graphs tend to bounce around between page 81 and 85. Matter of fact, the table on slide 17 is on page 81, but most of the descriptions on slide 13 is also on 85. So we'll kind of bounce around with that, but we'll be fine. If you're following along, in your textbooks. Just understand it's not going to be in a smooth order. Externalities can be positive or negative. Something happens to a third party. That's essentially what an externality is. And we'll give a couple of examples of each. A negative externality. A power plant. A coal-powered power plant. They burn coal. You probably don't want to be downwind of it. If you've ever been around a gas refinery, you don't want to be downwind of that. Any byproducts made from making a good or a service that has negative implications or negative impact on a third party is a negative externality. A positive externality usually is on the demand side. Too little of a good is being produced, and possibly you just want the consumer to actually use the good. A simple explanation of a positive externality: if there's an abandoned home in your neighborhood, someone comes up and buys it, well, you don't have to worry about unscrupulous people coming into the home because it's abandoned. You don't have to worry about it. Property values go up. You have a nice new neighbor. Everybody wins. And the reason that the person bought the home is there's an incentive somewhere in the local municipality that says, hey, if you buy this house, we'll give you a couple of $1,000s. We'll give you a tax abatement for a little while. Just bring it up to code so we won't have to worry about it. Graphing. If you'll notice, in economics, we love to graph. Whenever we can, we want to put a graph up to represent what we're talking about. Demand down, supply up. In a negative externality, we'll stick with the coal-powered the coal burning power plants. I'll get it right. I'm short of caffeine, so leave me alone. The true cost is actually point A. But right now, the coal power plant is actually at point C. A lower price, a higher quantity. If they were to install devices to make the soot coming out of those big tall chimneys cleaner, they'd have to pay for it. Well, that's going to be an increase in price, so it shouldn't be C, it should actually be A. This is what the graph is saying. And because we know as the price goes up, the demand will go down, fewer units would be sold. Realistically, it should be at A. Well, who pays for the negative externalities? Well, the public, because of bad health. So this is the difference in why you see negative externalities. And it also answers the question why these things go on, because the companies doing the supplying don't want to pay the bill. Someone has to pay the bill, usually the public does. A positive externality is when you do something to change the demand. Here's a tax incentive to buy an EV. Here's an electric car. You'll get $5,000 if you do. Okay, sounds like a win-win. The positive externalities, there wasn't an incentive, so you've taken the equilibrium point from X to Z. And in that, you've used what is politely known as the carrot or stick. A carrot is a nice something to actually encourage you to do something. The stick, on the other hand, is a negative reinforcement. So in order to actually try to promote the positive and do away with the negative, this is when we get into government intervention. Now, the government has a couple of tools in order to actually correct for negative externalities. One are just controls. No more lead paint. No more lead in gasoline. If you didn't know, both of those used to be very common. They're no longer there. Certain variations of Freon, the things that keep refrigerators cold, have been outlawed because they destroy the ozone. So those are examples of government controls. A Pagovian tax is another economist who has a last name of Pagovian. Hey, you come up with an idea, you get to name it. Cigarettes. I believe in Australia the tax per pack of cigarettes is somewhere around $15 to $20 a piece. Some really high tax. So that is meant to correct for the negative externality. People smoke, not good for you. They now need a lot of health care, increases cost, etc., etc. The Pagovian tax is to discourage people from buying cigarettes. Positive, again, possibly a subsidy. If you install new windows in your home, you'll get a subsidy of $5,000. We want you to actually take public transportation. We'll give you tokens to go take a bus. We will discourage you from driving in, say, London during normal business hours or New York. There's actually a tax in both cities for driving into those areas. They're trying to encourage you with the negative externality tax, the Pagovian tax, or the swat on the wrist, in order for you to take public transportation to ease congestion. So they may offer a discount, bus tokens or subway tokens or something of that nature. There's your positive externality. Graphically, how we look at correcting for externalities: demand down, supply up. Again, the producer or the supplier would incur the cost, but you have that drop, that dead weight loss. The tax is considered causing a dead weight loss. An economist might say, well, the true location for the equilibrium is C, but you're not including the externalities. So for society's benefit, the new equilibrium point is A. And the positive side, what you'll notice is the reverse. As we slowly get to, ooh, come on now. Come on, finish out. Nope, you don't want to do it. Okay, I'm stuck. You still get the lovely little triangle, but you're trying to change the supply in a positive light. And we'll just move on from that one. You don't want to finish correcting. From a global perspective, many countries actually put a tax on carbon. There are a couple of ways you can do this. The simple negative externality of a tax per carbon, again, you're just going to pass that on to consumer. Some countries try to work with the producers to figure out, maybe before you get to start the process, we'll come up with ways to actually cut down on pollution. And this is when we get around to correcting for the positive externalities. Again, what we're hoping to actually achieve. So you're starting to change the demand. And in this instance, demand going from X to Z. Well, if you're the one who's Tesla, Ford, or the Chinese company BYD, you're trying to incentivize people to actually purchase the more expensive EV or electric vehicle compared to the traditional ICE or internal combustion energy. See what happens when you start to read the paper and then you learn all these nice terms. The subsidies are to act more as a carrot to encourage people to actually do something that is a positive externality to a third party. Don't send your waste into a nearby river. Treat it before you do that. And all the way on page 85, this is just a list of an example of negative externalities and how they work, and the positive externalities and how to correct for that as well. Private bargaining, believe that the marketplace will figure out how to actually get this done. Although if you are dumping extra waste from a manufacturing process into a river, I'm not sure how private bargaining is going to work with that one, but this is probably where you come up with the government to actually correct for that. All right, as we talked about in the last chapter, marginal benefit, marginal cost. The cost will continually go up, and as you can see, the curve just goes straight up because the marginal cost gets incrementally more expensive. The marginal benefit actually starts to go down. It'll flatten out at some point. You cannot make products without some pollution or waste. So there is some point in society where you have to take a little bit of the bad in order to actually have things. The job of the marketplace and the government is to figure out where that equilibrium point is. How much risk are we willing to take? You still want to travel by plane. You know there will be some byproducts, some carbon monoxide coming from that, the same with the car and everything else. There's a middle ground. The whole idea is you as the consumer and the producer need to figure out where that is, and that'll be the job of you, the next generation of leaders. Government's role in all of this. In a case or Coase, another economist who gets to pronounce things because of his last name, or you get to call them and name them after yourself. This is on page 84 of your textbook. Private sector bargaining. You believe that it can be figured out through negotiations and you don't need the government's intervention. Falls in line with what Coase actually felt would happen, and your textbook uses something called the bee fable, or the fable of the bees. Rather than worrying about government intervention, in this analogy, beekeepers come to farms, let their bees out, they pollinate crops, so there isn't a need for any other intervention. Bees might do this normally, but you have to make sure the bees are in the right area. They could be pollinating anywhere, and farmers typically will hire a beekeeper in order to do this. Farmers in the general area will band together and hire one beekeeper to actually pollinate a number of fields, compared to, okay, we'll do it here, we'll do it there. It simply works better as a whole if there's a bargaining unit and they correct for this. Okay, other failures we'll talk about briefly. Asymmetrical information. This is what happens when one party has more information than the other. If you remember way back in chapter 1, we talked about all parties should have an appropriate amount of information to make an educated choice of what they wish to purchase or manufacture. Now, we can't have bad information or not enough information, which is why we call it asymmetric. One side knows and the other doesn't. If you are selling something, it is not to the best interest of the buyer if they don't know what's going on. In the gasoline market, your textbook has an interesting example. You are at a gas station. You are paying for a gallon of gas. Let's say it's $3. And the rest of the world, there'd be a liter, obviously. You don't know if a gallon is going into the tank or it's 3/4 of a gallon. Well, there are federal regulations on that, and they will come out, federal inspectors, get a nice container that might hold 3 or 4 gallons and test. This is an instance where you need the government to intervene to make sure the private parties are actually being honest. And you'd want some type of regulations, one being a licensed doctor to work on you or to have surgery. Yeah, I'd prefer that rather than someone who simply says they're a doctor by printing something up and posting it on the street. Just putting up on a window, hey, here's surgery, only $50. I'm not too thrilled with that idea. Those who are buying something have to be honest as well. Well, why do they need to be honest? What are we talking about? Well, in a prior life, I used to sell insurance, and we would ask a ton of questions. The person who's quick to buy insurance usually has something going on where they need the insurance. It's not always just, well, I want to protect other people. Let's say, for example, you like to wrestle alligators and crocodiles on your weekends. You decide to buy disability policies and not tell the insurance agent this is your hobby. Because you know if you mention that, you might be declined because the insurance company doesn't want to take the risk. The moral hazard of that is you decide not to tell them, and that is against the contract. When you're blatantly asked the question, do you have any habits that might be dangerous? Then it leads straight into adverse selection. You know this is happening, so you decide to do this anyway. All right. Last but not least, the last word talks about pollution, the problems with it, and how to correct for it, or at least give some ideas about it. All right, that takes care of chapter 4. Hopefully that was useful and beneficial. If it was, please share with your friends, like, subscribe, all that other good stuff. All right, then, I will see you in the next one. You have a good day. Study hard. Until next time.